When the mass exodus of Rohingya began in 2017, the world witnessed one of the most severe cases of ethnic cleansing this century. While many ended up in camps in Bangladesh, a smaller number were resettled in countries like the United States. Today, the Chicago region hosts a growing Rohingya community. In this presentation, I will walk you through how they came to be here, the challenges they face, and what we can do to support them. Let's begin with the colonial period, which laid the groundwork for decades of conflict. The Rohingya people had lived in Arakan, today's Rakhine state, for centuries, with Muslim communities established through trade and settlement long before British rule. When Burma came under British colonial rule in 1824, the British encouraged further migration of Muslim laborers from Bengal, today's Bangladesh, and India's West Bengal into that region. This significantly increased the Muslim population in Rakhine. Physicians for Human Rights and UNHCR explained that after independence in 1948, Burmese nationalists blurred these histories together, portraying all Rohingya as foreigners. Even those whose families had lived in Rakhine for generations were labeled as Bengalis or outsiders. This perception became the foundation for decades of exclusion and persecution. After independence, the Rohingyas' exclusion became codified into law. The 1948 citizenship law did not recognize them as one of Myanmar's national races, even though other ethnic groups were listed. Then in 1982, a new law made the situation far worse by essentially stripping nearly all Rohingya of citizenship altogether. Physicians for Human Rights and Human Rights Watch explain that this left the Rohingya stateless. Without legal recognition, they could not own property, pursue higher education, travel freely, or access basic health care. Amnesty International reports that this was not just bureaucracy, it was the deliberate use of law to make an entire people invisible and powerless. These laws set the stage for decades of systemic discrimination. These discriminatory laws were reinforced by repeated military and communal violence. In 1978, the Burmese army launched Operation Nagamin, or known as Dragon King, which drove about 200,000 Rohingya into Bangladesh. Just over a decade later, in 1991 and 1992, another 250,000 were forced across the border in another brutal campaign. Amnesty International documents how in 2012, communal riots broke out between Rakhine Buddhists and Rohingya Muslims. Entire neighborhoods were burned and hundreds were killed. The worst violence came in 2016 and 2017. After a Rohingya militant group attacked police posts, the Myanmar military launched what they called clearance operations. Human Rights Watch and the UN later recognized these actions as genocide. Villages were burned, women were subjected to sexual violence, and over 700,000 people fled in one of the largest refugee movements of this century. Despite overwhelming evidence of atrocities, Myanmar continues to deny that genocide has taken place. Human Rights Watch reports that the government insists these actions were legitimate anti-terrorism operations rather than systemic attacks on civilians. Meanwhile, Bangladesh has carried the heaviest burden. Today, nearly 1 million Rohingya live in Cox's Bazar, which UNHCR describes as the world's largest refugee settlement. The strain on local resources is immense, but Bangladesh has continued to provide refuge. The United Nations and international human rights organizations have repeatedly condemned Myanmar's actions, but Amnesty International points out that meaningful international action, such as sanctions or legal accountability, has been very limited. Perhaps most concerning, the violence is not simply in the past. Renewed clashes in Rakhine State in 2023 and 2024 displaced thousands more, showing that the Rohingya crisis is far from over and continues to evolve. After decades of persecution, Rohingya refugees began arriving in the United States in larger numbers during the 2010s, resettled through the Federal Refugee Admissions Program. According to the Illinois Department of Human Services and the U.S. State Department, refugee agencies placed early arrivals in a few key cities, including Chicago, Milwaukee, and Fort Wayne, Indiana. Chicago quickly became one of the largest U.S. resettlement sites. Al Jazeera reported in 2019 that Illinois was home to one of the largest Rohingya communities in the country, with about 600 families, or around 1,600 individuals. The Rohingya Culture Center in Rogers Park and West Ridge has since become the heart of the community, offering language classes, tutoring, and cultural programs. This step from genocide to refugee resettlement in the U.S. helps us understand how and why we now see a vibrant Rohingya community in Illinois today. The Rohingya community continues to rebuild even after enduring unimaginable trauma, but they still face many challenges. Many arrived without formal schooling, and the older generations in particular struggle with learning English and adjusting to U.S. systems. Yet, their presence has added new diversity, resilience, and cultural richness to Illinois. As I just mentioned, the Rohingya really struggle in Chicago because of language barriers. The elders never had the opportunity to attend school in Myanmar, and learning English as an adult is especially hard. The UNHCR then points out that, of course, employment opportunities are lacking when you can't learn the English language. Mental health is another pressing issue. Amnesty International notes that many Rohingya live with deep trauma from experiencing genocide, forced displacement, and loss of family members, and access to culturally appropriate mental health services remain limited in Chicago. The problem of statelessness also continues. Human Rights Watch explains that because Myanmar refuses to recognize them as citizens, many Rohingya lack clear documentation, which complicates legal status and pathways to permanent residency or citizenship in the U.S. And finally, refugee policy changes in the United States has had a big effect. Under President Trump, the U.S. refugee programs were drastically reduced, and resettlement of Rohingya was essentially frozen. Block Club Chicago reported in 2025 that many Rohingya families, they had hoped to reunite with relatives in Chicago, and yet those relatives remain stuck in overcrowded camps in Bangladesh. So this policy shift left the existing Illinois community isolated from family still overseas and placed even greater pressure on local organizations to provide support. So we understand the major problems. Let's get into some solutions. First, expanding ESL and family literacy programs would help break down those language barriers that limits employment and integration. Providing childcare during those classes makes participation more realistic for young families and especially women. Partnerships between the Rohingya Cultural Center and local colleges could also multiply resources. For example, university students could volunteer as tutors, helping children and adults learn English while also gaining cultural experience. A trauma-informed approach is also crucial. Because many Rohingya endured genocide and forced displacement, ESL classes and other community programs should be sensitive to signs of trauma. For instance, learning may be slower or require extra patience and encouragement. All of these efforts ultimately feed into improving employment readiness and family stability. Language, education, mental health support, they all come together to create better opportunities for meaningful work. And lastly, anyone can directly support this community because the Rohingya Culture Center in Chicago relies heavily on community support. They accept financial donations to fund programs like tutoring, immigration assistance, and case management. By contributing directly, anyone can help strengthen the resilience of this community and support refugees rebuilding their lives in Illinois. As we close, it is essential to remember that the Rohingya fled one of the most documented genocides of our century. UNHCR reminds us that their displacement is rooted in decades of persecution. Chicago has become home to one of the largest Rohingya communities in the United States. While this community is resilient, they continue to face steep challenges, learning a new language, finding meaningful employment, healing from trauma, and navigating legal systems without clear citizenship. But there is hope. Local partnerships with the Rohingya Culture Center, Illinois refugee programs, and U.S. government resettlement support provide a foundation for integration. The U.S. Department of State recognizes the Rohingya as a priority group, and ongoing support is vital. Finally, we cannot forget that the crisis is not only history. Renewed clashes in Myanmar in 2023 and 2024 mean that the Illinois community remains connected to a global struggle. Our response here through education, advocacy, and community partnerships is part of that larger story of resilience and human rights.